Hello, welcome to Voice Club. Welcome to Bristol, where I'm recording this introduction. This was a conversation actually that was recorded at Beyond Psychedelics in Prague between myself, Tim Adelin, Melissa Warner and Matthew Johnson, two fantastic people who I'm really honoured to have been able to record anything with at all. I've got quite a bit more coming with Melissa actually. She has a wonderful conversation with Rick Doblin, but perhaps it's best if I introduce the two of these guys to you. First of all, Matthew. Matthew is a PhD and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and a leading expert on the effects of psychedelics and really a leading expert. He's one of those people that's published so much, it's like how many rungs above the average. He's right at the top, you know. Really fantastic energy about him as well. Really open guy. Really enjoyed meeting him. Thank you, Matthew, for spending the time again. Melissa is very interesting as well. She's a co-founder of the Australian Psychedelic Society, board member of PRISM, which is the Australian equivalent to MAPS. It stands for Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. So really check out what PRISM are doing. I think it's important moving forward. Without further ado then, I bring you Melissa Warner and Matthew Johnson.
So I'm with Matthew Johnson today at Beyond Psychedelics in Prague, and Matthew is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the USA, and he's been a pioneer of the research into addiction with the treatment of psilocybin, and also profiling the nature of mystical states or peak experience. And I guess studying addiction, studying the alteration of consciousness through things like psychedelics is a way of studying consciousness. I'm quite curious to know, what is it that led you to have an interest in the study of consciousness?
Oh, great question. Great question, Melissa. I can come at that from a number of different angles. One angle is that I just have a great interest in the effects of drugs, really across all drug classes, whether we're talking about, caffeine or cocaine or psilocybin, alcohol, you name it. And I'm an experimental psychologist, and really with a strong emphasis on behavior. And my kind of core foundation, even though I kind of see these as schools of thought as tools in the toolbox, but one of my core foundations is as a behavioral psychologist. So I kind of think, if you're interested in drugs and behavior, how could you not be interested in psychedelics? And I think, in a sense, I think consciousness and behavior are two sides of the same coin. Behavior over the time reflects consciousness, and so some of the effects of psychedelics are so profound, and are in the domain of what people call consciousness, even though that, just the concept itself is difficult to deal with because, people use definitions for what consciousness is, but these strong alterations in subjective experience. It's just not uncommon for people to have an experience on a psychedelic where they say they could never put it into words, and that it has profound changes in the way they think and behave. If you're a psychologist, how could you not be interested in that?
Yeah, I think there's no better way to study the nature of consciousness than the alteration of it.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing I really liked what you said there was tools in the toolbox. So I guess that is the tools to alter consciousness from undesirable states. Mm-hmm. And there is an array of tools. So psychedelics are not the only tool in the toolbox. And what are the conditions that we're trying to alter in your research?
So in terms of problems or issues that we're trying to help people with, one is people dealing with cancer, severe depression or anxiety or both, which is common in cancer and other potentially terminal disorders. So we're very interested in that. We conducted a very promising trial and published it about a year ago, hoping to do a much larger study that might, with colleagues at a number of sites, that would gain approval for the non-research, just straight up therapeutic use of psilocybin. And then the other major therapeutic area that we're looking at is in the treatment of addiction specifically cigarette smoking, people who have tried multiple times to quit and have not been able to. But I should say also the foundation of our work and the initial studies that our group has done at Johns Hopkins or in people without any kind of diagnosable disorders. But of course, we're all human beings, and there's always things that can be improved. The betterment of well people, the kind of, if you would, self-actualization, positive psychology, in that spirit. I think our original research with those healthy normals, we're seeing the basic phenomena that we observe in those, we see them in these therapeutic populations, and in fact we see mechanistically similarities, such as the important mediating role of the mystical experience, the certain type of subjective experience after taking psilocybin, not just taking psilocybin. So it's predictive of better outcomes for just regular old people, healthy people, reporting improvements in their life and their attitudes and behaviors, but also mystical experience being tied to more likely being still abstinent from smoking months down the road after trying to quit, and also having less anxiety and depression.
So much to go with there. And I just want to, there's a theme that I sort of observed there with end-of-life anxiety, addiction. There's a sense of movement. There's a shift in someone's life that is occurring, and it's a matter of trying to deal with that. Whereas addiction is being stuck somewhere. So there's something about a dehabituation, would you say? Yeah,
I think actually dehabituation is a great term. In fact, that's similar to some of the language that Tim Leary used in talking about these agents, which I think we should return to. I'm interested in really looking at these effects as learning trials, as conditioning. I think there's something like dehabituation that's going on, but I would say I sort of hold that as going on not just with the addiction treatment, but also with the cancer distress and anxiety, and presumably with the research that the Imperial Group published with straight up depression patients, outside of a cancer context. And we're currently doing a pilot study with straight up depression patients right now. But I think that, yes, it's a big shift in their life that kind of got them, the diagnosis of cancer that got them to this place. But I think they too are stuck. And so whether you're stuck, you're sort of stuck in this narrow pattern of behavior when it comes to addiction. I'm a smoker. Oh gosh, I've relapsed again. I've tried a million times. I'm never going to be successful. I'm just a smoker, being stuck in this loop. Or in how you're dealing with cancer, like, I deserve this, why me? This is this great punishment. I'm some people, come in holding this kind of judgment that God is punishing them, or just some other kind of narrative. For people that medically can have right now a very full life, they're not having a full life, not because of the straight up medical consequences of their cancer, but because of that narrow thinking that the cancer diagnosis has led them to. So I view that as very similar between drug addictions, or this sort of addiction to thinking of yourself, your life in this certain way.
Story.
Yeah, absolutely. A negative self-story.
Exactly.
It's just a repeating thing that someone can't really get out of, and it's such a phenomenally restrictive thing as well. Like it's a real affectation to be in that place. You're really contending with it. So here I'm gonna scramble around here at a question, but it's to do with mystical experience, and to do with the fact that we know that when the mystical experience does occur, in these therapeutic sessions, that is correlated with much better outcomes, which is really, really fascinating. And you could talk about it from so many different ways, but I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on how you've recognized, your patients be able to set, like, what kind of story can they move towards? Is there a resetting of some underlying goal that happens? It's kind of a breakthrough from the negative self-story, open to the world, or open to a different way you can be in it. There's a breakthrough that kind of happens there, and I'm particularly interested in, for people who might not have had psychedelics, right, and who might not have access to them. Like, I'm interested in how we might describe what it feels like to imagine how to be in a different way, and that kind of acts in some unconscious and really fundamental way as like a new landscape you can live in and be part of. I know I'm throwing things at you here, but could you talk to how someone who might not have had a mystical experience before could grip onto how their whole conception of themselves and what it is to feel like to be then can change?
Sure. I think a good analogy, which is very salient for me right now, being in the Czech Republic from the United States, is travel. And Michael Pollan, I believe, makes this point in his recent book about psychedelics. I think it's a great point, great analogy. Travel introduces you, it makes the million things that you're habituated to in life that you don't even recognize their influence.
Absolutely.
And all of a sudden you're aware of them. Like, I don't know how to open this door. Like, I don't know how this appliance works. It's like, and you take a second to figure it out, and just or if you're in London and everyone's going up on the left side of the stairwell, just like when they're driving, it's like you notice these things, and you don't notice that when you're back home. Everyone's just doing their thing, and you are reminded of how much of life and circumstances that we just skip over. That we rely on heuristics, and the older we are as human beings, the more we rely on these heuristics. And that's important, in that those heuristics are part of wisdom that hopefully we develop over time, but it can also lock us in a certain way of thinking and not even recognizing, just that initial recognition that there is another way. And I think some of the most dramatic experiences are like that, where what they kind of break through to might differ for the individual, whether that be more connection with their family, more of a perspective of other people in their lives, more of a sympathetic view of themselves. A lot of people, they would take far more compassion on someone else if they were from an external perspective.
Right.
Or sometimes we've had many patients in various studies returning to things that they did. They say, I wrote, a 50-year-old woman said, I was really into poetry in college. I haven't written poetry in decades. And they're like, I love poetry. Why am I not writing poetry? So they start writing poetry again,
Yeah, it's very interesting. Melissa, do you have...
So themes of the habituation of the mind, of allowing people to enter transition into their lives. I'm curious about the other tools in the toolbox and how your research into meditation relates to psychedelics. Because meditation is another way of dehabituating the mind. It's a practice, and has been reliably shown to have some similar effects in the brain to psychedelics. But I'm curious about how these two can combine, because meditation is hard, particularly for somebody who is suffering from mental illness or who is suffering from addiction. It's a practice that you have to curate over a decent amount of time to be able to get the rewards out of. And what I know you have been doing research into the combination of using psilocybin with meditation and with experienced meditators. Is that correct? We've
finished and published a study with novice meditators, 75 folks that, the type of folks like a lot of people say, I've always kind of been interested and I've tried a few times over the years and I can never quite stick to it. But
it's even better. It reveals more.
And we haven't finished it yet, but we've been working with, in this new study, long-term meditators, people with any number of, some 10,000 hours of meditation over their lifetime, sort of looking at a broad number of questions of how that might impact their current practice, whether they get more out of their practice. And on all of these questions, we of course look at both sides of the coin. Maybe it hurts their practice, these types of things. In the novice meditators, something we can speak to, the results of, we saw a clear signal of an additive effect on various measures such as altruism, improvements in quality of life, engagement in spiritual practices, and sort of reaping the benefits of spiritual practice. We essentially found that whether you had sort of a really heavy dose of spiritual practice support, so having not just having the psilocybin session, and not just having kind of our standard, what we think is minimal for safety, preparation and then follow-up, integration. For this high support group that we included in this study, these people had extra integration sessions, and they were able to do something really cool that we haven't done in other studies. We actually had our subjects formally get together in discussion groups and share their experiences with each other and have mutual support.
What were some of the experiences of the participants?
Well, there were a large number of participants. Really, I would say in terms of the core experience, it was very similar to our other research. Strong, high rates of mystical experience defined by these criteria of a strong sense of unity, a sense of positivity. There's a sort of a noetic quality, which refers to this like self-revealing quality. Somehow it's more real than real, and a sense that the experience is so profound it's beyond words. And we actually found that one group had just a kind of a trivial dose of psilocybin, kind of serving as a placebo, and getting just, even if you're in the standard support group without that kind of extra heavy dose of integration and the discussion groups, that just having the high dose of psilocybin, even without that extra support, that was what was responsible for having high rates of mystical experience. But then, in terms of the fruits of that mystical experience, the question: how does that mystical experience translate into improvements in your life? So
we don't want just altered states; we want altered traits.
Yes, and this is very much in the spirit of Houston Smith, who talked about and wrote about this, that mystical experiences are one thing, but spiritual experiences are one. But then
the word
spiritual
life. And with meditation, I know that it's a bit of a hot word for some people, particularly if they're from a scientific background. And so with meditation, I'm curious to know what were the measures in what kind of cognitive change were you looking for? Things like non-reactivity, acceptance, a sense of meaning, things like that. Just to break down the word, what spiritual is referring to here. And the other thing is in this group, so I'm curious because meditation has an ability to allow you to navigate your mind with greater ease. Was there a difference in the meditative group with their ease of the psilocybin experience?
Yes. So make sure I understand you correctly. Did they? Well, I'll say in our long-term meditators, folks have said that they can slip into different states more readily, and there's some variation. Some folks will say that they can get more out of a shorter time of meditation now, and interestingly, I think some folks seem to take their meditation less compulsively. So, in one sense, this might sound odd, but one can kind of think of meditation as being stuck in a rut. I mean, there are folks that can, be, if you don't get your 1 hour or sometimes several hours of meditation in every day, you feel like you've failed, and not cutting yourself any slack, like you're traveling or something, and
flexibility.
More flexibility. Thank you. That's a great way to put it. More flexibility in their meditative practice. And
probably in the other areas of their life too.
Yeah, in some sense of a common story we've heard is that just an increased recognition that it's not about the practice, it's about where you get with the practice. And so, you may not need that practice to that degree all the time.
Yeah, it requires an engagement with the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's another interesting thing about psychedelics and the mystical experience or the peak experience is this sense of awe and wonder at the world, which participants frequently report.
Yeah.
This orientation away from the internal self to the wonder and the majesty of what is out there.
Yeah. And
an engagement with that. Can you speak to that effect?
Yeah, and in fact, I'd point folks to a recent, what's soon to be published paper by our colleague at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, Peter Hendricks, has a paper titled, I think, Awe as Antidote. Postulating that awe is maybe an under-recognized construct at play here with these, therapeutic and the betterment of well people effects of psychedelics. This idea of through pharmacology or whatever other means, confronted with something so much larger than oneself, that the sense of self and sort of the problems that can come along with the sense of self-identity can be helped, and whether that's kind of staring out before the Grand Canyon, or maybe having 30 milligrams of psilocybin running through your blood. Can lead to these profound experiences of awe. So I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah,
and that's closely
methods.
associated with the mystical experience. And you've used the term peak experience a few times, and I should say those may be completely synonymous concepts that are described slightly different. That's kind of my working assumption, or they might be slightly different shades of the same phenomenon.
Yeah, I feel that they're the same thing too, just defined by different groups or different people. Abraham Maslow defining peak experience, and I believe mystical experience was defined along with like the Walter Pahnke experiment, using psilocybin in earlier before the laws were changed.
And earlier folks, Walter Stace and even William James, were kind of focused on this construct. But yeah, in terms of really making progress and understanding with psychedelics, Wally Pahnke and Bill Richards in our group made great contributions there.
Anything you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have too long left. So perhaps my final question would just be, so what drives you to be interested in doing this? And I'll leave that broad.
Yeah, I can come at that at a number of directions. I guess from one perspective, I kind of think, what is meaningful in my life? Like, what am I? I'm only going to be around a little while. Right. I mean, I'm 44. Like, I might be half. I might be.
You're
far.
A sprightly 44, I have to say.
I
Jesus
know,
Christ.
Some folks take me for my 20s, and
Must be all that
I joke that
psilocybin.
I finished college when I was 10 years old, but no,
Yeah.
I'm nothing like that. But and I'm involved with a variety of research topics beyond psychedelics, but I really see psychedelics as something that can, doing this work can really contribute to the health of humanity. I think we're getting to, and let me preface it by saying I think there can be a danger in speaking too largely about this.
Yes.
And it's not a panacea, and I'm certainly not saying everyone should use psychedelics, but we are dealing with constructs that I think are really important, and psychedelics is perhaps just one way, but the topics that we're dealing with, this sense of unity, that we are all ultimately a part of something that is beyond ourselves, and that we are all ultimately completely interconnected. Like, we're all ultimately on this little rock in the middle of space, and we're all we have of
Right.
each other. If we don't really get that broadly, our species is in trouble. And I think we're at the time in the history of humanity where, and I don't know whether it's the next 5 years, 20 years, 100 years, but it's a blink of an eye in terms of history, but we're there right now. And, being someone who has training in behaviour and pharmacology, studying psychedelics is one way that I can contribute to something that I think is meaningful in terms of hopefully helping us get through this period. I think we're either going to make it or not. You know,
Right.
are we going to be around in 1,000 years? And what's the nature of? I know this is a really big picture,
No,
but
no,
I don't want
we're
to
totally
say this
with
is
you.
the only thing in that category. In fact, it may be ultimately be a minor player, but it's something. It's an area that I can contribute to in that larger picture.
No, absolutely. Well, I mean, psilocybin, the compound is obviously a minor player at some level, but the mystical experience, the feeling of connection, right, opening up to something
Yes.
new, okay, seeing the world in a way you didn't see it before, in a way that has at least the belief that there is a good that you can be a part of with it, that there's a life there, that there's a vitality you can tap into, that same sense of vitality is ultimately what grounds relationships between all individuals of any group. You know, I think it is, you know, there's many different ways to open what you are authentically to a real relationship with someone else and the world. And psychedelics administered properly with the due amount of serious intent, you know, and it depends what we mean by serious, seem to be a way that certain people can get there and then also aim their lives at helping others to participate in that same kind of sharing and experience. But I know we do have to wrap up. Melissa, thank you so much for being with me doing this.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, well,
And Matthew.
And thanks to both you, Melissa
Yes,
and Tim.
and
This
Matthew
has
as
been
well.
great.
So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We'll see you soon.
Cool.